Think for yourself. Question authority.
What's up, guys? Welcome back. Now, one of the main reasons I started doing YouTube was exactly for this type of video we're doing today. When I see inconsistencies in information being reported, this is when I'm thankful to have an audience to inform of these things, and in turn, I know I've done everything I can to report on it correctly. So, there has been a lot of talk on the Switch OS firmware and how certain chips were discovered that pointed to new Switch hardware, such as the Nintendo Switch Lite that was just revealed a few days ago. So we're going to go in depth over that information, but also new information will be revealed in this video regarding the Switch Lite SOC that hasn't been reported yet, and it does tie in with both the Switch Tegra X1 chip revisions, and also we are going to talk in depth about what yields on an SOC production line mean. I can almost guarantee that a lot of you watching this video are going to have your minds blown when you see what I'm going to show you. Everything discussed will be linked also in the description. In regards also to the data miner named Mike Heskin, I have a lot of respect for the work that he does, so this isn't a video to discredit him. I know he is simply reporting what he saw in the firmware code, but it should be pointed out before we dive into this that just because certain things listed on a firmware update like chip numbers, RAM types, and even clock speeds doesn't necessarily mean each and every part of those will actually physically come out to the consumer in some kind of release of a console, and a lot of the time it is just for developers' eyes only, since they use firmware data for other things during game development like gamers will never see. Also, with new hardware, especially for something with, say, a new motherboard, new SoC chip type, and new NAND flash memory type, it's honestly very unlikely that a new console like that would appear on any of the current Switch OS firmware updates, since for consoles with new chips that are, say, an upgraded Switch in this case, what would be more likely is that this new console is getting its own variation of the Switch OS firmware and will have its own OS firmware update separately from the current Switch hardware, but still be backwards compatible. However, small revised chips of the Tegra X1 processor, which is basically what is found here, would of course appear on the current OS Switch firmware. So keeping that in mind, a lot of things said by him and by Digital Foundry, since they have used Mike as their source in their article on it, is speculation on their part, not from actual sources like developers who have seen actual new Switch hardware, so keep that in mind. Also, another thing is that the main reason these people are searching so hard to find an upgraded Switch is due to all the rumors from the Wall Street Journal and Nikkei over the last year. So they are looking especially hard to find anything that could be a new console in the field they specialize in, which of course is data mining. And I of course can personally sympathize with that, since that's exactly what I've been doing as well, just looking in other places for info on new Switch hardware, which I've shown multiple times Nintendo is in fact working on a new Switch with enhanced features, not just increased horsepower, and I've shown it in multiple job listings. In fact, there is so much evidence of it just from their job listings that started popping up for multiple new consoles and SoCs in mid-2018. I'd be surprised if they don't actually have a new console by 2020 at the latest, including any minor revisions. So after the Switch Lite was revealed, Mike Heskin went and tweeted his best guess for further revision hardware, only based however on OS firmware data mining, so keep that in mind. So he said there are two Marico Tegra X1 chips, the T210B01 and the T214. And these have been listed in the Switch OS firmware since early 2018. In fact, I did a video in 2018 covering if Switch would get 8GB revision of the console, but back then it did appear to just be RAM for developers to use in their dev kits. So looking at this, here he brings up something strange that apparently is in the OS firmware. Now remember, these are all Tegra X1 processors, just different numbered models. And we'll discuss what these small differences could actually be in a moment, but he says here that both of the T214 chips listed support LPDDR4X DRAM with planned support for 10nm chips. Now, there are some very interesting things about this, and one of those things is that the Tegra X1 processors only support LPDDR4 RAM, not X. They don't actually have any support for LPDDR4X from official documentation by NVIDIA. Only the Tegra Xavier chip actually has support officially by NVIDIA for the LPDDR4X memory. Then on top of that, it mentions support for 10 nanometer chips. And again, I have to remind you guys that just because it's listed in a firmware doesn't mean it will be used. The 10 nanometer process might have been a future plan at some point, but it's already been confirmed by NVIDIA that they are skipping from 12 nanometers down to 7 nanometers, and they already have 7 nanometer chips in the works for 2020 with their recent June 2019 partnership to produce these GPUs with Samsung. So I do think there is outdated information on the OS firmware that simply needs to be removed or updated, since it's highly unlikely NVIDIA would bother with making any 10 nanometer chips when literally all major GPU and CPU manufacturers, and besides Intel that is, who are having issues with their fab process currently, have already long since moved on to the 7 nanometer process. So moving on, then he acknowledges what I also reported in my last video, that the new eMMC sizes could be possible, which, by the way, the original Tegra X1, the one in the launch Nintendo Switch, already supports eMMC 5.1, which is the newest version of that flash NAND memory. And there have been modders already that have actually increased the internal NAND of the Switch to 128 gigabytes in some cases, but a max 256 gigabytes is possible already on the current Nintendo Switch. But obviously back in mid-2016, that would have made the Switch very expensive just based on the memory cost alone. Also, as we know, the Tegra X1, Parker, and Xavier chips all only support eMMC 5.1. They don't support other NAND types, which of course is a contradiction to what he mentioned earlier, saying that the FCC filing for HAC-001-01 was corroborating that the Tegra X1 Mariko chip was getting tested. But since we know that they completely changed the NAND type from the original, and that the X1 doesn't support anything except for eMMC, which he even mentions here. So basically what is being reported here is incorrect information, since the Tegra X1 wouldn't support a different NAND type. Also, I need to point out that what Nintendo tested on July 9th, 2019, the HAC-001-01 wasn't using the same name as the original Nintendo Switch, since the original Nintendo Switch they tested under the same filing at the FCC was the HAC-001. So this new -01 with a new motherboard, new NAND type, and a new type of SoC can't really be a Tegra X1 processor, or they wouldn't need to change the motherboard or NAND type, just like my previous video brought out. So it's the same listing on the FCC from 2016, but the actual console itself, all the components of it, and the name they gave it, them changing all the hardware of it, signifies a brand new Nintendo Switch console, not related to the original, but just filed under the same FCC listing. Now, I understand that some might disagree with that being a brand new Switch, mainly because of the FCC listing being the same number. But it is legal for a company to do that, and makes sense to hide a new console for being noticed too much if tested it as a brand new listing for a game console, because that's what they have to do. They have to list it as a game console on the FCC, and then everyone will know right away, oh my gosh, that's a brand new Nintendo Switch completely. But the fact of the matter is, they tested a brand new console with completely new hardware, completely new components. So you can believe that, or you cannot believe that if you want, but that is actually a fact. They did test a brand new console. Now here's the big kicker. I want you guys to pay attention to this. It's going to blow your mind. On top of all that from my last video, we got even more proof now since then that both revision chips listed in the Switch OS firmware were not, I repeat, were not used in that FCC testing. What is that proof, you ask? Well, remember, the data miner said that the FCC testing corroborated that a Mariko revision was coming, but for some reason, you know, that little announcement Nintendo made the other day about this new console coming, the Nintendo Switch Lite, which is also using, remember, one of the two Mariko T214 revision chips. Well, if the Mariko T214 revision was what they tested at the FCC, then explain to me why the Nintendo Switch Lite was not even tested at all at the FCC. Nothing at all, not one test. You won't find anything there, and I'll leave the links in the description. Nintendo did not test the Nintendo Switch Lite on the FCC, and it's using the same Mariko chip, which of course under normal circumstances Nintendo would need to test that at the FCC before setting a launch date, and that's exactly what all console manufacturers do. They do all those tests before they actually announce so they can have a date set and not have any delays. Which leads to the next point. If Nintendo did not need to test the Nintendo Switch Lite, why in turn would they need to test the other Mariko T214 revision chip as well? The answer to that question is pretty simple. They wouldn't need to test either of these chips since they already work on the original Nintendo Switch motherboard. They are basically the same chip with some slight differences from the original. So, due to Switch Lite being based on the same chip variant as the other Mariko chip, this should technically rule out both Mariko chips from needing to be tested at the FCC for anything, and either way they wouldn't be compatible with any other NAND flash type than eMMC 5.1, which for Switch Lite is only one of the few reasons why it didn't get tested at all. Now, what this also implies is that the Switch Lite is using the same motherboard as the Switch OG, which you can see here. Now, when you look at the size of this, you can tell that this would in fact fit inside the Switch Lite. Also, the Switch Lite probably doesn't have the same kind of heatsink as the OG Switch has, and also runs at a lower power, which now leads us to the next question. What exactly is the Nintendo Switch Lite SOC? We basically confirmed the codename, right? But I also looked again at the original Switch specs listed by Nintendo versus the Switch Lite. And I actually forgot way back then that Nintendo just called the original Switch a customized Tegra, when in reality it was actually just a stock chip. So upon further investigation, the Switch Lite appears to also be running a stock chip. And I think we've been able to identify what chip it is based on. So take a look at this. What this is the Jetson Nano module board, and it has already been confirmed to be running a Tegra X1 processor. The interesting part though is that the Jetson Nano was released in March 2019, so Nvidia was ramping up production of the chips for this device during that time and after. So take a closer look at the SoC chip itself of the Jetson Nano. See the code there? PKF T14. Now, I can't confirm, of course, 100% that this is based on the T214, but that T14 at the end looks like it could be based on a variant of the T214 chip in the Switch Lite for the Jetson Nano. And if you look at the specs of the Jetson Nano, it fits right in line for what the Switch Lite would be targeting. Half the CUDA cores at 128, and the CPU is clocked at 1.43 GHz. So likely the GPU is clocked a bit higher too, but it's targeting 472 gigaflops of FP16, which is about 236 gigaflops for FP32. In comparison, the Switch OG in handheld mode is 192 gigaflops. So for the Switch Lite, after they adjust the clock speeds down a bit, since these specs for the Nano are likely based on its 10 watt output, that would likely put the Switch Lite at around the same range, if not a bit better, than the Switch OG as a portable only device. Also, since Nvidia was already making this variant of the Tegra X1 in mass production, it makes sense that a full ramp up of production for the Switch Lite with this chip started sometime in March 2019, when some of those rumors were starting to really pick up steam for the Switch Mini, if you recall. So what about these Tegra X1 chips makes each one different, you might be asking? Well, for one thing, the Switch Lite likely has 128 of its CUDA cores disabled and clocked differently, so that one seems to be obvious what makes it different. But there is also that other Switch OG revision chip as well that is rumored. And we'll have to bring up that Emily Rogers did mention that a revised Switch that is set to replace the current OG Switch might be revealed soon, with basically the same price as the current Switch, which is $299, with some improvements to battery life, higher CPU clock speeds, and more storage. So this lines up with the other Mariko 2214 chip that the data miner was talking about, which would probably be something Nintendo wouldn't quote-unquote have to announce. But if they are adding some storage and it's a similar battery boost like the Switch Lite has, then they will likely announce it similar to how Sony did with the PS4. They release a slight improvement to the vanilla PS4 with 1TB of storage instead of 512GB, and added HDR support for 4K TVs. And the Xbox One S likewise was similar, but added 4K TV HDR support with upscaling and got a small 60 MHz GPU clock speed boost, and slightly increased memory bandwidth, which made some games run a few frames per second better, but it was almost not noticeable in most games. So why would this new version of the Tegra X1 Mariko in a Switch OG revision be able to have better increased clock speeds and battery life without changing much of anything about the chip, you may be asking? This goes back to what I mentioned at the outset of the video for what we're going to discuss about yields and SoC production lines. So the only benefit of continuing to use a chip this old as a Tegra X1 processor is that over a few years' time, the performance yields increase to being nearly top quality silicon per chip made. And you may have heard about the term garbage silicon being sold for cryptocurrency, right? Well, what that is basically GPUs or CPUs or whatever consumer chip products are being manufactured. Those are the chips that they qualify usually as defective, that don't meet target specs due to hardware defects in the silicon during production. And this is a normal occurrence that happens for all chip makers. So the quality of the chip can depend on a lot of factors for a brand new SoC, especially to have high yields. And high yields would be something like 90%, meaning for every 1 million chips made, 900,000 of those chips meet target specs. This can depend on the design quality by the maker of the chip, and we'll just use NVIDIA as an example here. And then the foundry that produces the chip themselves, let's say it's TSMC, and then we have to add in a buyer of the chips, and of course we'll say it's Nintendo in this case. So back in January 2015, over 4.5 years ago, the Tegra X1 processor was a brand new chip. NVIDIA launched it with the Shield tablet and Shield TV, and as we all know the story, the NVIDIA Shield was basically a sales failure, and by early 2016, NVIDIA had a lot of back storage of the Tegra X1 chips they weren't selling. So by mid-2016, they partnered with Nintendo, right? And Nintendo then purchased these chips for the Switch launch that was going to happen in March 2017. So NVIDIA likely had around 1 million or so chips ready for Nintendo to start with, but of course Nintendo wanted to buy probably at least 10 million of those Tegra X1 processors. And then after seeing how the launch of the Switch went, they'd in turn buy more in bulk, of course. Now, remember, the Nintendo Switch original model launched and wasn't running the X1 chip at its full potential, even in docked mode. The CPU was clocked at 1 GHz, and the GPU in turn was clocked at only 768 MHz, which now of course you're seeing some modders overclock the CPU to over 1.7 GHz and over 900 MHz for the GPU, getting smoother frame rates and 720p resolution more consistently in games like Doom, for example. So many have the question why they are able to OC the system this high and why is it clocked so low to start with? Well, it's two reasons when you think about it. First of all, they had to think about the portable mode and its battery life. So lowering the clock speed somewhat makes sense so it's not too far away from handheld mode. But also, in 2016 and 2017, Nintendo, now of course this is speculation so don't quote me on this, but likely Nintendo ordered every last Tegra X1 that NVIDIA had to sell as many Switch consoles as possible. So what that likely meant is that Nintendo went ahead and purchased even the quote-unquote garbage silicon produced Tegra X1 processors and then adjusted the target clock speeds for the Switch overall a bit lower to meet the lowest common denominator for the worst performing yielded chip NVIDIA was producing at the time from TSMC, or whichever foundry they were using to make the chip, which in turn led to the Nintendo Switch being lower clocked than expected. So now of course after a few years have passed, Switch production has long since stabilized, the system isn't selling out anymore, and it's not an issue finding one in the stores, right? So what does this mean for production? Well, it means that Nintendo can now be more picky in what chips they want to use for the Switch hardware, meaning that they can now pick the higher yielded chips only and release a revision that is clocked a bit higher due to the higher quality chips. So now, for example, NVIDIA and TSMC can, let's say, make 2 million Tegra X1s a month, and let's say 85 to 90% of those chips are high yield, top quality, and close to hitting the target specs, not only in power level, mind you, but also in battery consumption. Then Nintendo has the option of choosing those 1.85 million chips and telling NVIDIA to toss the 150,000 or so left over as quote-unquote garbage silicon, the ones that didn't meet hardware specifications, so that they can use the best yielding Tegra X1s that they have, which is now basically in turn the T214 version, which is the newest version of the Tegra X1 processor. So is it starting to make sense to you guys? And on top of that, since memory costs have dropped, they can do something similar to an Xbox One S type of revision to the Switch OG and release a Switch that simply replaces the old one with probably 64 gigabytes of NAND flash eMMC storage and better CPU clock speeds to help stabilize performance in some games. And a revision like that would not be considered a Switch Pro, but more like an Xbox One to Xbox One S kind of improvement. So, after all this information we've gone over, what can we expect from Nintendo in terms of an enhanced Switch versus all these revisions listed in the OS firmware? Well, from what it appears, the coming revision is not, I repeat, not the same console we've been seeing in development step by step in the various Nintendo Redmond job hirings we've been going over on this channel since mid-2018, or the same console that Nintendo met with developers about, according to the Wall Street Journal. Remember this quote from the Wall Street Journal about the enhanced Nintendo Switch. One version will have enhanced features targeted at avid video game players, although it won't be as powerful as PlayStation 4 Pro or Xbox One X, according to parts suppliers and software developers for Nintendo who have access to a prototype of the machine. So would a slight revision to clock speeds and a little bit extra storage, would that be considered adding enhanced features for avid gamers? I don't think so, right? This sounds like the Wall Street Journal is referring to a brand new upgraded console. Also, Nintendo would not be needing to give developers any access to a prototype machine with enhanced features way back in March 2019 of this year if it was just a Mariko revision with some higher clock speeds and more storage. Why would developers need to test that is my question. Testing a prototype of a revision with higher clock speeds would be a waste of time. It would be like asking Square Enix, hey, come and test our brand new Switch with a slight bump in clock speeds. And Square Enix would be like, Nintendo, we can already adjust our Switch clock speeds in our dev kit in debug mode, remember? Which, by the way, if you hack your Switch, you can overclock your Switch yourself, just like a developer would. So there would be no reason for a developer to go and test a prototype of this new console. So basically, here's my best guess on what is next with Nintendo. We have Switch Lite, which will release on September 20th for $199, and we have a rumored Switch OG revision with some slight improvements to storage and clock speeds that could actually release with a small announcement in late July or early August, since that's what Emily Rogers is rumoring. But remember, that's just a rumor for now, so take that with a grain of salt for that part of it. But that type of revision does make sense for the same price as the current Nintendo Switch to act as a replacement for the original and be more attractive to new consumers looking to try a Switch for the first time at that $299 price point. But I don't think current Switch owners would want to get that console if they already own a Switch OG, since they'd not see the benefit really, especially if they already have big SD cards for the storage. Then finally we have the console that Nintendo tested at the FCC under a new naming, the HAC-001-01. About 5 days ago, they needed a completely new motherboard, completely new type of SoC of chip, and a completely new NAND flash memory type, which would mean likely that they are going for high-speed UFS NAND flash, which is actually comparable to SSD speeds, but that's basically the only other type they can use really. This console, in my opinion, is the console to watch out for, and sounds like the one that has been rumored to have enhanced features targeted at avid gamers, and it has prototypes out in the wild for developers to use and obviously make their games for, according to the Wall Street Journal. And it lines up with the upgrades we've found on various job listings that I brought out here on this channel, as what Nintendo is actually working on in Redmond, Washington with their software engineers. So the question is, will this console come in 2019 or 2020? We'll just have to wait and find out. But it's certainly been exciting seeing all these things play out over the last year. Alright guys, that is a lot of information to consider, but if you did enjoy this discussion, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. And I'll talk to you very soon in the next video. Have a great day.